Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the second presentation, introducing the writing of the God. In the previous presentation, I talked a bit about the context of the writing of the God and tried to situate it broadly, if not exactly, within the context of magical realism as a genre. In this presentation, I want to talk about the key philosophical, or really the key religious theme in the writing of God, the theme of mysticism. Because again, I'm going to be making a variety of references throughout the presentation, I wanted to share my screen with you, give you a kind of visual cue to follow along. So we'll do that now and begin our discussion of mysticism. Now, many of you have probably heard the term mysticism. You may have read mystical writers, mystical poets. You have a vague or general idea of what it is that mysticism involves. The goal of this presentation is just to take the knowledge that you already have, the sense of mysticism that you already have, and build on it a little bit in the hopes of increasing your appreciation of the writing of the God and the role that mysticism plays within it. I want to divide this presentation into two parts. In the first part, I want to talk about the history, the etymology of mysticism, where the term comes from. And then in the second part, I want to talk about mysticism as a specifically religious practice, some of its components, conventions, and motifs, and how those might play out in the writing of the God. So we'll start with etymology. The English term mysticism derives from this relatively unassuming Greek verb, muo. The most basic meaning of muo in Greek is to close, to shut, or to conceal. And it can be used with these meanings in a wide variety of contexts. It can refer to closing your eyes, closing your mouth, closing a door. It's a kind of generic verb that means to shut, close, and conceal. Now, muo is related etymologically and semantically, that is to say in terms of its history and in terms of its meaning, to another verb, the verb muao. You can think of muao as a kind of more precise version of muo. So if muo refers generically to closing in a variety of contexts, muao refers specifically to closing one's lips. Closing one's lips. And of course, by metaphorical extension, it comes to mean something like to keep silent. So these are the two of the three. We're going to add another one in just a second, but two of the three verbal roots from which the English mysticism derives. And already with these definitions in place, we can begin to get a sense of what mysticism is about. It's something to do with secrecy, something to do with concealment, something to do with not publicly divulging information. You may be interested to know that these two verbs are the root of the Latin word mutus, which of course gives us the English word mute. So there's something about secrecy, silence, concealment that's at the heart of mysticism. I said that there's a third verb we're going to add to the mix, and it is this verb, mueo. Mueo, as you can tell based on the spelling, is closely related both to muo and muao, but unlike muo and muao, mueo is in fact a technical term in ancient Greek. All of these are Greek verbs. Mueo means to initiate into the mysteries. Now, of all of the definitions that we've given so far, this is surely the most puzzling. What are we talking about? What does it mean to be initiated, and into what mysteries are we being initiated? The best place to start, I think, is to see that the initiation in question here is an initiation into the cult of some god or goddess. It's important to note that the word cult in English has a very precise connotation. It usually refers to a small, fringe, splinter religious group, usually fronted by an especially charismatic leader. Maybe you remember or have seen reports about David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, Jim Jones. Maybe you've heard of the Heaven's Gate cult. This is not how the word cult is used in religious scholarship, and it's not how I'm going to use the word in this presentation. For the purposes of this presentation and religious scholarship more generally, cult refers simply to worship or devotion. It derives from this Latin verb colere, which just means to worship. So that's the sense in which I'm going to be using the term cult throughout this presentation. So, mueo, initiation into the mysteries. What are we talking about here? What we're talking about, initiation into the cult, the worship of or devotion to a particular goddess. In the case of ancient Greece, and again, all of these verbs are Greek, so we're talking primarily about a Greek context at the moment, there were any number of religious cults. They were called mystery cults into which one could be initiated. The most famous, however, was what is called the Eleusinian mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries. Now, the term mysteries in this context refers generically to the set of rites and rituals that one would have to go through in order to become a member of this particular cult, yeah? To become an initiate into the worship or devotion to a particular goddess. In the case of the Eleusinian mysteries, they are so called because they were practiced in Eleusis, which is a Greek town in West Attica, I don't know, 10 or 15 miles northwest of Athens. And it was home to a very famous cult in ancient Greece, the cult of Demeter and Persephone. Now, you may be familiar with the myth of Demeter and Persephone. Demeter is, of course, the goddess of agriculture, the harvest, the cultivation of land, and so on. And Persephone is her daughter by Zeus. If you're familiar with the myth, you will recall that Persephone is abducted by Hades, the god of the underworld, and taken down into the underworld, at which point Demeter, who of course loves her daughter dearly, is so grief-stricken that she's incapable of carrying out her functions as goddess of agriculture and the harvest, and as a result, things stop growing. Now, Zeus is quite reasonably concerned about this state of affairs, and so he dispatches his messenger Hermes, called Mercury in Roman mythology. Zeus dispatches Hermes to go to the underworld and retrieve Persephone, to take her away from Hades. Hades balks, he doesn't like the idea, so he cuts a deal with Zeus. He says, I'll let Persephone return to Demeter, I'll let her return to the land of the living, but she can only spend 9 months a year there. For 3 months a year, she has to return to Hades and serve as my bride and the queen of the underworld. Zeus agrees to this condition, and so it came to pass. Now, as a result of this condition, as a result of this sort of pact or agreement that Zeus makes with Hades, Demeter is, of course, happy for 9 months of the year while Persephone is with her, and she's sad, grief-stricken for 3 months a year while Persephone is sequestered away in the underworld. And this, of course, is supposed to be related in some way to the cycle of agricultural cultivation. So for 9 months of the year, things grow. For 3 months, when Demeter is sad and incapable of carrying out her functions as goddess, things don't grow. And this, of course, corresponds to the winter months. Okay, so just a brief rundown of the Eleusinian mysteries. A couple of other things you may want to know about the mysteries here. First of all, and most importantly, they were to be kept secret. This is critically important. They're mysteries for a reason, and not to be divulged publicly. And this, of course, brings us back to the root meaning of the verb muo, to close, to shut, to conceal. It's also related, of course, to the verb muao, to keep silent, not to publicly divulge. In fact, the prohibition against the public divulgence of information about the cults in the case of the Eleusinian mysteries was so strong that it could be punished by death. So, got to keep things secret. Here we're seeing, again, a connection to the root meaning of the verb that the term mysteries and eventually the term mysticism derives from. Another thing that we might want to keep in mind about the Eleusinian mysteries is that a person who has successfully gone through the process of initiation was called a mustes. The word mustes just means an initiate, someone who has successfully completed the process of initiation. Mustes is a noun. In Greek, it refers to a human person in this particular case. One way of forming adjectives in ancient Greek is by adding the suffix ikos to a noun. This is roughly equivalent to adding the suffix ik or ikal to a noun in English. So for instance, you can take a noun like botany and turn it into an adjective by adding ikal. So botany, botanical. You can do this with all sorts of words. Biology, biological, philosophy, philosophical, and so on and so forth. That's roughly what's going on in the case of mustes. Now, if we take mustes, the noun, and add the adjectival suffix ikos, we get mustikos. And mustikos is now an adjective that means something like connected to the mysteries or related to the mysteries, having to do with the mysteries. So in ancient Greek texts, you will find references to the mustikoi logoi, the mystical words. So the words that one would speak or recite in the process of cultic initiation. You also see references to the bios mustikos. Bios is term for life in Greek, like in biology, the study of life. So the bios mystikos is the mystical life, or the life of someone who is connected in some way with the mystery cults. So we have mystikos, the adjectival form of mustes, which is in turn derived from mueo, which is in turn derived from muo, meaning to close, to conceal, or to not divulge publicly. Now, the adjective mystikos passes into Latin as mysticus, just a Latin word for mystic or mystical. From here, the Latin mysticus passes into the Romance languages, and for our purposes, most importantly, French as mystique, passes into Spanish as místico, and so on. Then the French mystique, as a result of the Norman conquest of England in 1066, William the Conqueror, Battle of Hastings, increasing French influence in England, mystique comes into English as mystic and its variants and derivatives, mystical, mysticism, mystique, and so on. Okay, so there's just a little sort of etymological rundown, how it is that the term mystical comes into being in English, and how it's connected critically with the idea of secrecy or concealment. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to turn to the second part of the presentation. And I ask, in a somewhat more general sense, what mysticism is. What mysticism is. This is a very complicated question. Mysticism is an incredibly complex phenomenon that does not admit of easy definition, but we're going to give it a shot nonetheless. Maybe the first place to start, the first thing to note, is that mysticism is almost invariably associated with religion. Now, this is not to say, of course, that there aren't non-religious uses of the term mystical or mysticism. Surely there are, but certainly in an historical sense, mysticism is always closely associated with religion and religious practice. So if we're going to understand mysticism, we're going to have to think about religion more broadly. I want to give you a way of thinking about religion that I think will be useful for understanding mysticism. But before I do that, just a really quick caveat. I'm engaging in a series of massive simplifications here. What I'm about to say about religion won't apply to every religion. It may not apply to any religion entirely. Not every religion can be mapped on to the categories I'm about to provide, but I think they do apply in sufficiently many cases to justify them as at least heuristic devices for understanding the concept of mysticism. So, two ways, very generally, with all those caveats in mind, two ways of thinking about religion. Here's one way. You can think about religion doctrinally. You can approach religion doctrinally. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, very generally, I mean, you can approach religion in terms of the beliefs that it holds and the beliefs that it expects its adherents to hold. Yeah? These will have to do with what the religion believes about God, what it believes about morality, what it believes about humans, human life, the afterlife. In each of these cases, we're talking primarily about an intellectual question. When we're thinking about religion doctrinally, we're thinking about what sorts of propositions, what sorts of claims, truth claims, does the religion make, and what sorts of truth claims does it make of its adherents? Yeah? That's what we mean when we talk about religion doctrinally. It's important to note here that in principle, at least, the doctrinal aspect of religion, or the doctrinal approach to religion, is at least in principle publicly available. So if you, for instance, want to know about the beliefs of Judaism, if you want to know about the beliefs of Islam or the beliefs of Christianity, you can learn these beliefs by consulting textbooks or sacred writings or summaries of Jewish doctrine, summaries of Islamic doctrine, summaries of Christian doctrine. Yeah? So we have beliefs that are primarily intellectual, to do with propositions that I'm supposed to assent to if I'm to be a member of this religion, and these doctrines are, at least in principle, publicly available. So that's one approach to religion. Here's another approach to religion. I'm going to call it the experiential approach to religion. The experiential approach to religion is obviously going to be related to the doctrinal approach. Every religion worth its salt, every religion of any degree of sophistication is going to have both components. But in general, the experiential approach to religion is less interested in beliefs than in feelings. So the question is not so much what is it that an adherent of this religion believes, but what is it like? What is the sort of interior or internal experience of an adherent of this religion? If the doctrinal approach to religion is intellectual, the experiential approach will be primarily emotional. Now, again, I have to keep adding these caveats and provisos. We're not talking about two categories that are mutually exclusive. All religions, at least all religions that I'm aware of, have both doctrinal components and experiential components. So if the experiential sort of approach to religion emphasizes feelings and emotions, whereas the doctrinal emphasizes beliefs and intellectual assent to propositions, it seems also to follow that the experiential approach to a religion will be, unlike the doctrinal approach, private. This isn't to say, of course, that emotions are entirely private. They can be communicated in language, but emotions are the sort of thing that can't be communicated entirely in language. Something will always lack. Something will be missing. Here there are two very, very, very general ways of thinking about how one might approach religion. Well, how does this help us to understand mysticism? I think like this. You can think of mysticism as belonging, as you may have guessed, to the experiential branch of religion, or to the experiential approach to religion. But it's not just any experiential approach. You can think of mysticism as aiming at or trying for or attempting to cultivate an especially acute or intense religious experience. Yeah? So it's the experiential approach to religion, but in an especially acute or intense way. That in general is what mysticism is about. That's what it aims at. Now, of course, this is still a very generic and very vague definition, so we have to add some flesh to this skeleton. To do that, I want to move to this question. So what does this look like? And by this, I just mean mysticism as a sort of a quest for an especially acute or intense religious experience. What does that look like in practice? What is the mystic looking for? What is he or she seeking? There are a couple of stages in the process of mystical experience. And here, I'm not referring to any particular mystical tradition. I'm just sort of trying generically to summarize a broad variety of mystical traditions and pick out those things that they seem to share in common. So where do we start? Well, we start with practices. And these are usually called something like mystical practices. Yeah. These are practices that aim at attaining the kind of acute or intense religious experience that is the goal of mysticism. What sorts of practices might this involve? Well, you can probably guess. Prayer. Prayer is going to be central to mysticism. In any variety of mysticism of which I'm aware, practices prayer in one way or another. Now, this prayer can obviously take a number of different forms. It could be the recitation of set prayers. It could be sort of spontaneous personal prayer. It could be maybe the repetition of a mantra. It could involve like a prayer aid of some kind, maybe an icon or prayer beads, whatever the case may be. Prayer is going to be at the heart, and under any of these descriptions, going to be at the heart of mystical experience. So we have prayer on the one hand. A second component of mystical practice, and again, we're sort of simplifying and generalizing here, is some or other practice of purgation. So the word purgation comes from the verb to purge, to get rid of. Yeah. There are lots of practices of purgation that characterize the world's mystical traditions. Fasting from food and water is a very, very popular practice of purgation. Sensory deprivation is another example of purgation. So maybe like sitting alone in the middle of a dark room as you're engaging in the practices of prayer and mantra speaking and so on. So you have prayer on the one hand and purgation on the other. Now, these practices are not practiced for their own sake. They have a particular goal in mind. They're aiming at something. And what they're aiming at goes under a variety of different names. And this we can think of as kind of like the second stage in the process of mystical practice. So these practices of prayer and purgation, deprivation, fasting, and so on aim at what scholars of mysticism often refer to as mystical union. Now, the idea of mystical union it's a generic term. It's not the sort of term that most mystics will use to describe themselves. It's a scholarly term to describe a wide range of related or analogous phenomena. So, for instance, if you're familiar with Islamic mysticism, Islamic mystics refer to this sense of mystical union, which I'm going to describe in more detail in a moment, as wahda. Wahda. Now, wahda means something like unity or oneness. It's closely related to this word, wahid, which is just the Arabic word for one, the numeral one. If you're familiar with Hindu mysticism, so Hindu mysticism, or sort of Hinduism in general, has the concept of ananda, which is the idea of bliss, sort of eternally enjoying the presence of the divine. All of these have in common, all of these sort of varieties or local ways of expressing the idea of mystical union, they all have in common a couple of things. First of all, they are the result of the mystical practices that we mentioned in bullet point 1 above. That is to say, they are consequent upon those practices. They come as a result of it. Second, they have in common the sense that as the mystic engages in these practices, chanting, prayer, fasting, sensory deprivation, and so on, he or she begins to sort of take leave of the world of the senses, to take leave of the world of reason, to take leave of the world that surrounds us that we all know so well. And as the mystic takes leave of this world, he or she enters a new or a different or a higher realm of reality. And this realm of reality is a sense of oneness or unity with the divine, with the universe, with the source of all that exists, with God. And that is the basic idea of mystical union, a sense that you are taking leave of your physical surroundings, taking leave of your senses and your reason in order to be united with, to be sort of melted into in an act or an experience of mystical unity with God, the divine, the universe, the one, depending on the tradition that we're talking about. Okay, so that's the idea of mystical union as a consequence of the mystical practices we mentioned earlier. Now, there are two important consequences of mystical union itself. So mystical union can be thought of as a consequence of the practices, is what you get as a result of successfully engaging in the practices. And the mystical union itself has two important consequences. The first of these consequences sometimes goes under the name of ecstasy. Now, the word ecstasy is a Greek word that literally means to stand outside oneself. To stand outside oneself, to be removed from oneself, to exist apart from oneself. It doesn't take a whole lot of reflection to see how this might be a consequence of mystical union. So as you're taking leave of the world of the senses, the world of reason, the world that surrounds you, and you're being sort of melted into a sense of unity or oneness with God or the divine, you also begin to take leave of your ego. You begin to take leave of yourself as a separate entity that stands apart from or over and against God, over and against the world, over and against your fellow human beings. And one way that mystics often describe this process of sort of the melting away of the self is in terms of dissolution. So the idea that as a result of mystical union, the self itself disintegrates, it dissolves away. So that I, as an individual ego, as an individual person, an individual self, cease to exist as I am sort of blended into or melted into the unity of all that is in my mystical union with God or the universe or whatever. So that's ecstasy and the dissolution of the self that is consequent upon it. A fourth category that we want to include in this discussion as well is the idea of Ineffability. Ineffability. This actually brings us full circle right back to the beginning of the presentation. So you remember that the word mystic and mysticism and mystical all derive from that Greek verb muo, which means to shut, to close, and the Greek verb muao, which means to keep your mouth shut, to be silent. A characteristic of much mystical experience, regardless of the tradition from which it emerges, is that the mystical experience itself, the experience of mystical union, the ecstasy or the dissolution of the self consequent upon it, is ineffable. And what ineffable means is just unspeakable. It cannot be communicated in human language. It can't be contained by human thoughts. It can be contained by human concepts. It exceeds in some way the capacity of the mind, the capacity of language to articulate it and to understand it. It is secret in the deepest sense of the term. It cannot be divulged. Yeah. So here at the end of the mystical process, as I mentioned earlier, we come back to the beginning of our etymological excursus. Secrecy, concealment, the inability to publicly divulge information. This is the culmination of the mystical process, according to lots of mystics. Okay, so just a brief history of the term mysticism, a very, very brief and of course massively simplified description of how it is that mysticism works, or at least can work in certain traditions. Now, what I would encourage you to do is to take a look at the writing of the God, read it carefully with these concepts in mind, and to ask yourself, how is it that these concepts play themselves out in the writing of the God? Where do they appear? Are there references to ineffability, to ecstasy, to mystical union? Are there examples of mystical practices in the text? If so, what are they doing there? What is Borges trying to teach us? What point is he trying to make by referencing these practices, ideas, motifs, and conventions? Okay, very well. That will do it for this presentation. As always, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to let us know. Happy reading, and until next time, have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.